Hello, and welcome to a quick video explaining the differences between how GA4 and Universal Analytics measure things. Specifically here, what we're interested in is questions like, can I take sessions from UA and plot that on a graph with sessions from GA4? Are they similar enough to allow that? We're not going to be interested in things about tag manager configs, so we're not going to talk about that, how the technical setup is different. And we're also not going to talk about how the interface is different, because there's loads on that and you could fill several videos with it. Instead, we're just focusing on the how and why are these numbers different. Is it that Google have renamed things? Is it that they've changed, for example, how certain metrics are calculated, so you can't use one in the same place as the other? As well as talking to the how and the why, we're going to talk through some bounds that we found. So we've done this work for a lot of sites, and we're just going to talk through, like, on average, how different should these numbers look, just to give you some ideas. And then we're also going to talk through a reconciliation process to help you try and figure out, if you are looking at things and you're going, these are very different, is that just a natural difference in the metrics, or is it that there was some sort of incorrect setup on the site? So we're going to give you a process for figuring that out too. Right, let's hop on in. What's the difference between how Universal Analytics handled dimensions and how GA4 handles them now? The answer here is basically nothing. The one big thing that it does do is it just makes something explicit that was previously implicit within this one, and which is, while it might seem a little bit more confusing at first, is probably quite helpful in the long run. So within Universal Analytics, everything existed at one of three levels, or scopes: at user level, session level, or hit level. There's also e-commerce, but we'll skip that for the moment. Now, this is obviously pretty explanatory. Obviously, sessions is session level and users is user level. But the tricky stuff came when you came to adding in dimensions. Dimensions also existed at these levels. And this is where we could run into problems. This is going to be easiest with an example, so we'll just talk through an example. Suppose that over this period of time, someone visited our website and they visited one session through Google and one session through Bing. Well, you would get, obviously, one session here and one session here. That's the correct number. However, we also have users here in this table as well, and we've just added in source. In this case, this user is going to be counted once for Google and once for Bing. So that's the same user has appeared twice now. We've double counted a user. And that's because source is a session level dimension. It counts the source of each individual session. So when we paired a session level dimension with a user level metric, we ended up over counting this. And you might have just done this without even realizing it. You probably looked at this report and never realized that users was over counting. But it was. In GA4, they've now made this explicit. So as you can see, when we pop into acquisition, we have user acquisition and traffic acquisition. So with traffic acquisition, when we hit this drop down here, we now get session source, session medium. And if we come over to Universal Analytics, to GA4, we can see we have first user source and first user medium over on the user acquisition screen. We have user level sources and we have session level sources. They're both included in here separately. What does this mean practically? It means that if you're moving from GA4 to UA, the thing to pay attention with is many of them in UA, and the ones that you typically use, particularly the ones around source and medium and things like that, those were all session level. So if you want the equivalent stuff in GA4, you're going to have to look to traffic acquisition, or you're going to be looking for these session level dimensions. So that's our big important takeaway there, is that now we get multiple options of dimensions. The session ones are equivalent to UA, and their user level ones are exclusive to GA4. Okay, so that's dimensions. So now we're going to move from dimensions onto metrics. There's a lot more different about how metrics work, so we're going to spend a little bit longer on this one, and we're going to talk through each metric or each of the big metrics in a little bit more detail. And we're going to start with users. Is users in Universal Analytics the same as users within GA4? And the answer here is no, and it's no for two reasons. The first reason is that in Universal Analytics, this users over here refers to all the users who visited your website. In GA4, as you might have seen when I hovered over earlier, this refers to the total number of active users. That's not all users. That's users who had either what counts as an engaged session, so a session that lasted for a particular amount of time or had a particular number of views in, or it was users who arrived for the first time. Those taken together is active users, and that's what's shown here under users. If we hop into the Explore screen, we can see this a bit more explicitly in GA4, where if you go to add this, you won't see users in here. You will just see active users and total users. The other big reason is reporting identity. If you come into your admin screen and you get admin property settings data display, we can see that we've got blended and observed. observed is the closest to universal analytics. Well, observed is the same as universal analytics. Blended is not. It also adds in model data. So that's Google Analytics making guesses where it doesn't have the data itself and attempting to guess where users basically exist. So what does this practically mean for comparing the two of these? If you're comparing users from GA4 to universal analytics, what does it practically mean? It means that if you're going to compare them, you need to use users from here and you need to use total users from here, not users. It also means that you need to have the reporting identity set up to be observed, because if you have blended, then you're getting additional data that universal analytics never had access to. If you're doing all of those things, we found it was anywhere between 3 to 10% difference between universal and Google Analytics. If you're doing all of those things, we found that on average, the difference was between 3 to 10% between universal analytics and GA4, and that the difference remained consistent over time. Let's hop into sessions. How is sessions different from GA4 to universal analytics? And the answer here is this probably has the biggest difference in terms of measurement, in terms of the measurement model. The big differences all come from session splitting. So this is where what you think would be one session is practically two sessions. And there are a couple different scenarios in which one session could become two different sessions. And two of these used to exist in universal analytics and they don't anymore in GA4. What that means is you'll typically have slightly fewer sessions in GA4 than you will in universal analytics. Let's just talk through the scenarios one by one and it will become a little bit more clear. So the first one is, suppose you have someone visiting your website and they have one page view at 11:58 and they have another page view at 12:02. It's all part of the same browsing period, but in universal analytics this counted as two separate sessions because it happens over midnight. And whenever midnight happens, all sessions get started again. So in this case, universal analytics split this one session into two, and in GA4 it doesn't. The second one is, suppose you're browsing around your website and somebody has left some UTM tags in your nav header. In this case, the first page view just is your standard session, but as soon as you then have a page view with a different set of UTM values, it begins a new session. This isn't the case in GA4. If you had a page view and then you had another page view with a different set of UTM sessions, even if, let's suppose that they had landed on your website, let's suppose you've got multiple tabs open, one of them is organic traffic, one of them is your email program, and you open one organic search and you land on a website to organic search, then you hop to another tab, click email and land through the same thing. In that case, that would still count all as the same session. It doesn't split sessions anymore with different UTM tags. Those are the two big differences in sessions. What does that practically mean for sessions? It means that usually sessions is going to be slightly lower on GA4 than on universal analytics. It has the same concept, it has the same timeout. You can think about it in roughly the same way, except those two causes of session splitting no longer happen. So that's the big difference between this one and this one over here. Okay, so the next one is page views. How is page views different in GA4 to universal analytics? For 90% of people, page views is going to function in exactly the same way. However, there are two cases that are worth mentioning. The first one, which you're probably aware of if this is already the case with your website, is that in GA4 you can store both an app and a website within the same property. That's why this is called views in GA4 rather than page views. So app screens and web pages. This means that if you want to compare pages here to universal analytics, which only did the web version, you will need to filter out all of your app traffic. Again, I suspect you're probably aware of that though. The other one is if you have a single page app. So if we just hop over here to an example of it, this is the piped out internal query platform, and this one here is a single page app. This means every time I click these pages, the entire website isn't reloading, it's just reloading a part of it. In universal analytics, only the very first page load by default would fire a page view. And then if you wanted it to track all these other page views where I was clicking around, you have to do additional custom setup to make that work, which is a little bit fraught and a little bit harder to do. This is in comparison to if you have a more standard website where when you click any different page on here, the entire web page is reloading each time. This is no longer the same in GA4. If you have GA4 enhanced measurement, it will track all of these sort of clicks within a single page app by default. So notably different, and you will see notably more page views for single page apps in that case if you didn't do that other piece of setup. So what does that mean so what does that practically mean as our differences between Pageviews in UA and GA4? Unless you fit into the case of a single page app, or you are looking at a combined app and web property, you should see Pageviews should be very, very similar between the two of them. We typically found it between 1 to 5% difference between the two of them. And again, on the lower end of that property, once all the sort of errors and things had been fixed, we found that typically you could mostly map one to the other. Okay, so let's now talk about purchases. Do we need to think about purchases differently from GA4 to Universal Analytics? And the answer here is no, we don't. They behave in approximately the same way. The tracking setup is slightly different, but again, that's not practically what we're talking about here. We're talking about differences in the numbers. And the differences in the numbers should be very low, particularly with purchases and transactions, because one, they are atomic, which means they can only happen once, and they all come with their own ID. This is unlike sessions where you could not in Universal Analytics by default easily get the session ID out. You can get the transaction ID out. This means that if your developers were reconciling and trying to make sure that your UA and your GA4 successfully tracked across the migration period last year, they had IDs to map where one was missing and one or had incorrect values. Typically what this means is that we found that transaction and e-commerce numbers behave very, very similarly across GA4 to UA because they were far easier to also debug and set up, anywhere between 1 to 5% difference, again, on that lower bound. Okay, so next, goals. How are goals different in Universal Analytics to conversions in GA4? Again, for our output purposes, there is one primary difference that means they may not add up. A goal, when you create a goal in Universal Analytics, can only fire once per session. So either the session manages the goal or doesn't manage the goal. If, for example, you had a destination page, thanks.html, and you visited and refreshed that page twice, this would still only trigger as one goal per session because the goal is just, did I meet that goal? A conversion that you set up by default in GA4 is not quite like that. It counts once every time it happens. So if you were to visit thanks.html twice here, it would count as 2 conversion events per session. Now, they added this new option in April 2023, I believe, which is the configure an option to set a conversion so that it happens once per session. If you have this set for yours, then from whenever you set this, then at that point, your conversion will be tracking as similarly to Universal Analytics as is essentially possible. And when that is the case, we found the difference was typically, again, between sort of 1 to 5%, usually, again, on the lower bound. Okay, so those are our practical differences about how dimensions and metrics are different. Are there any other things that will essentially affect this? Are there any other things that would cause us, if we were to plot, for example, like I've done here, GA4 sessions and Universal Analytics over each other, that these numbers won't behave the same? Are there any other things that we should be aware of? And there are a couple fairly common top-level differences that you should also be aware of. The first one, if we hop over back to Universal Analytics, is filters. In Universal Analytics, you could add filters at a view level. So you would have your property tracking from your website, and then for each view, you'd often have an unfiltered view, and then you would have a filtered view, where you would go in and you would add various filters to remove IP addresses, to remove certain referral traffic that was spam, all of that sort of stuff. In GA4, any filters are destructive, so they delete the traffic and you can no longer get it. What this typically means is that people don't filter traffic in GA4, they instead just filter out at a report level. This means that if you're comparing your GA4 to Universal Analytics, you will want to compare an unfiltered Universal Analytics property to whatever GA4 property you might have here. Our next big thing that catches people out is the attribution windows. So this is how attribution works in both Universal Analytics and in GA4. They both use last non-direct click attribution. What that means is that if you have a session here, an organic session, say at the beginning of month 1, and then 5 months later someone comes back to your website, same browser, same phone, but this time they just go direct to it, that session will be reported as organic rather than direct. That's because it is the last non-direct session, and by default in Universal Analytics that window is 6 months long. So if you had an organic session here and then it took someone 7 months to come back, this should be reported as direct, because again, that window is 6 months Universal Analytics. In GA4, that window is only 90 days. This practically means that you will see notably more, or you should expect to see notably more direct traffic than you did in Universal Analytics. Our third big difference is excluding query parameters. So in Universal Analytics, you had the option to exclude query parameters. This meant that if you went to a URL, like let's say that we went to the piped out site, and we put a query parameter in the end, perhaps we did, perhaps we had a tracking G-code thing, we could say to our analytics, ignore the parameter gclid, and it would report in our analytics as just this. This is no longer possible in GA4. What this means, and if we just pop over to this example here, is it means that now your page views, your sessions, your whatever, might be a little bit more split apart than you previously saw. So here in our old world, suppose that we took the parameter color and we had excluded that from Universal Analytics. In Universal Analytics, this is what we would report. T-shirts would have all of our sessions or page views or clicks, and T-shirts color red would have 0 because we have excluded it. In practice, this is what actually happened, and in GA4, this is what we will see because you can no longer exclude the parameters. If you want to do that, you again have to do that after the fact with some analytics and some calculations. So another thing to be aware of when you're looking at the different breakdown between them, if you've excluded parameters, it is no longer possible. Okay, so suppose we are looking at our GA4 and our Universal Analytics and we're wondering why they don't match up. Is it just a natural difference between how sessions is calculated now and how it was calculated beforehand? Or is it something else? Is it something wrong to do with our setup? This, I'm just going to give you a quick top overview of the process that we ran with people, or we've occasionally run with people now. That has been helpful. Obviously, at this point, you can no longer go and change Universal Analytics data. However, we have still occasionally run into scenarios where people have launched their GA4 instance last year. They haven't really changed it much since then, and so still by going back and comparing against Universal Analytics, but they were still able to find some bugs now that were still on their site because, again, a huge amount of analytics work hadn't happened in that intervening period. So, what do? We basically take the GA4 and Universal Analytics and we plot them side by side. So we've got them here. In this case, I've got sessions. And then what we're looking for here is we're looking for a consistent difference here. If you have a non-consistent difference, typically means that people are making some changes and that one of those numbers is going to be inaccurate. Assuming that we have a consistent difference, we then come down to the dimension segmentation. So what we do here is we've joined our GA4 and our Universal Analytics traffic, and then we've picked a handful of sort of top-level dimensions: country, device, channel grouping, page path, browser version, and we have plotted whatever metric we're looking at. We've got sessions in this case, but it could be page views, it could be conversions, and we've said, okay, what percentage of overall traffic, or overall sessions in this case, comes from each of our dimensions? So in this case, we can see that France got 27% of our overall sessions in GA4 and 27% of our overall sessions in UA. This means the relative difference was about 0%. And this relative difference is what we found to be pretty consistent when GA4 was set up correctly. We found that when the two of them were set up correctly, that the relative difference between the traffic was often between 0 and 1 to 2% at maximum. If you find that, if you're finding then bigger swings, things like that, it could be indicative of more problems or more tracking issues that you're having. The only one here of note is that sometimes things like channel grouping or medium and source would see slightly different numbers. This is partly because of the attribution window that we mentioned here beforehand. That 6-month attribution window can often mean you will get slightly more direct traffic than otherwise. And I think in this anonymized example, there is also a little bit of changing of channel definitions. And that makes up essentially the differences here. So yes, if you are looking at the two of these and you're wondering why are they different, is it that my setup is wrong, is it that the numbers are measuring differently, those are the two things that you want to check. And again, you want to look at those sort of benchmark numbers that we've got overwritten in the blog post to see on average how big should this difference be for you to be worried about it. Okay, so hopefully that's been helpful. You can see down in the description below we've got other videos on this topic, and we'll also have the report that we showed in here for the reconciliation purposes. That report is built using BigQuery, but hopefully it will be a good inspiration if you wanted to go set up and run this own process yourself. If you'd like any help in general with GA4 and particularly the BigQuery and the data warehousing side for it and the reporting, we're a small team, remote team over here at Pageviews, and that's exactly what we do. We help SEO and marketing teams with their data problems, often particularly those focusing around BigQuery and data warehousing and getting advantage of that data. So please feel free to reach out or just leave us a comment and we'll see if we'll be able to help. Great, that's all for now, and let's see you next time.